Welcome back to another episode of Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Sebastian Lebrec. The Ontario legislature returns today after a long summer break. MPPs head back to Queen's Park under rather interesting circumstances, as political parties are also getting ready for a snap election. This could happen as early as winter 2025. So, against this backdrop, what will be the priorities of the governing Progressive Conservatives this fall? How do the Ontario Liberals and the NDP get ready for an election? And how do they position themselves as the alternative to the Ford government in the eyes of the voters? To help us analyze these dynamics, I invited three of my Strategy Corp colleagues on the podcast today. Joining me are our newest principals, Aidan Grove-White and Fraser Macdonald, as well as Kelly Baker, a manager in the Toronto office. Thank you so much for being here. So, as I mentioned, it was a bit of a long break, so let's do a little bit of catching up here. Can you tell us what each party has been up to since Labor Day? Let's start with the PCs, maybe, Fraser?
Sure. Thanks, Sebastian. The break in terms of the legislature has not meant a break for government office holders. They've been working quite aggressively behind the scenes to prepare for a busy legislative schedule, which will be kicking off today. And so we've had some of these items teased in the media or openly discussed at press conferences, including, for example, the announcement coming on bike lanes. But we can expect, I believe, bills covering some things on housing, labor, transportation. It sounds like some kind of cost of living relief. And probably many more things, including, I think we're hearing some stuff coming on energy as well. So it's going to be a packed legislative schedule, and really what the government strategy here is that they're doubling down on the themes that helped them get reelected in 2022, and are continuing to go back to that same coalition of voters and trying to demonstrate that they're, to quote their phrase, getting it done.
Kelly, what kind of summer did the Liberals have?
Well, I think for Bonnie Crombie and the 9 MPPs that they have sitting in the legislature, given they still don't have party status, it's really going to be about getting voters to get to know who Bonnie Crombie is. I think she is, well known to people in Mississauga, having been the mayor there for a while, and people who probably follow politics. But I think really outside of the GTA, there's not a lot of awareness of who Bonnie Crombie is, what she stands for, or even, quite frankly, what the Liberal Party stands for these days. I think they really need to rebuild their brand and focus on their core priorities. And I know Bonnie said that they'll be releasing their platform soon, but they really haven't been quite clear about, why voters should choose to return back to the Liberal Party at this time. So I think, leading up to an impending election, that's really something they're going to have to focus on, is rebuilding their brand and, the awareness of Bonnie to Ontarians.
I think in a similar vein, the Ontario NDP have been thinking about brand, but they've been thinking more about the brand of their leader, making sure that Marit becomes better known to Ontarians. And they launched a recent mostly digital campaign of It's Marit, where we're trying to show Ontarians that Marit is the leader that cares most about them. But in addition to the get to know the leader, I think that they've been doing a fair bit of gardening or tending to their grassroots. They've been going to a lot of smaller communities in Ontario, meeting with local leaders to talk about the local challenges they're facing. They've proposed to all of the assembled at the Association of Municipalities of Ontario conference that they would have a new deal for cities, not just Toronto and Ottawa. And since Labor Day have been really pushing that message that the downloading that has been done by the Liberal and Conservative governments of the last 25 years is what's caused a big mess, and that they would reverse it. But overall, their focus has been on the grassroots when it comes to labor, promising for stronger labor protections and anti-scab legislation, and addressing the usual sort of housing crisis and strengthening public services like education and healthcare.
It sounds like the name of the game for the Liberals and the NDP in recent months and going forward has been in part the name recognition of the leader based on what you're saying, Aidan and Kelly. So Fraser, perhaps let me go to you on this. So clearly Doug Ford does not have a brand recognition issue. People, know who he is. So what does he focus on in the coming months?
I think the biggest thing is just staying in the driver's seat, keeping in control of the agenda. I think with some of the more challenging issues management situations they've had in the past year and a half or so, they at times have lost control of the agenda. And I think that one of the last times I was on this podcast talking about what they would be looking to do, I said, get back control of the agenda. I think they largely have. And I think they'd like to stay that way. And so what I am expecting is as I mentioned, the legislature being very busy with new legislation, regulations, spending on those key priorities in areas like creating jobs, building infrastructure, keeping down the cost of living. And I do think, healthcare, while it's not necessarily something they put in the window, they need to show Ontarians that they're investing enough in healthcare that it doesn't, completely slip through the cracks. And so those are the themes that got them reelected 2.5 years ago, and I expect those are the themes that they're going to continue to run on. And right now they're hugging so much of the center of the voter pool that if they stay there and the voters are happy with their performance on those issues, it's going to be very hard to dislodge them.
So Kelly, you mentioned that the Liberals don't even have party status. So this is kind of a weird situation for them because there's legislative work this fall, but then there's also preparing for a potential election. So how does that all play out in Liberal land, you think?
Yeah, and I was reading an interview with Bonnie, and it specifically said that she is planning on spending the next few months on the road, and I suppose less time in the legislature. I mean, the other problem for the Liberals is Bonnie Crombie doesn't have a seat, and she has yet to even pick a seat that she's going to run in Mississauga. And given that she was the mayor for a number of years, presumably she won't have too much difficulty choosing a seat or winning a seat in Mississauga. But clearly she needs to be out on the road, again, getting to know voters. And again, talking about Liberals' priorities, like to Fraser's point, last week I was at a speech with Doug Ford, and I don't think Doug Ford really mentioned healthcare once. It's not something that I think they're prepared to really run on their record on healthcare is really not that strong. So if I was Bonnie Crombie, I would be looking at that and saying, how do we rebuild the healthcare sector? How do we invest in education and transportation and transit? And I think the things that the Liberals were typically interested in.
Aidan, the NDP is the official opposition, and they have to make sure that merit is known to voters. And there's an election. What does that all mean? Sounds like a lot of work.
They're also in a bit of a pickle because the Ford government has created a target-rich environment right now with, a war on bike lanes or, building a big tunnel under the 401, putting in legislation to reduce the regulatory framework around building new highways. And these are all going to be things that they're going to want to talk about, but a lot of them are also traps. It's not their own grassroots, which they've been going to over the summer and since Labor Day, want to see them say stuff about that. But I know what the NDP want is to focus on a broader message to show the rest of Ontarians that they share the priorities of the average people in Ontario, whether that's making sure municipalities that the balance of what they're expected to pay for and how they're expected to pay for it is right. Make sure we've got the right infrastructure to support jobs and housing, making sure public health is strong. Like we went through, the pandemic. It's kind of like all of us never want to think about it again, but there were a lot of lessons from that, and it's not clear that we've implemented all of them. And then of course they've, since Marit was elected leader, they've also had some other planks that they've been putting out, including the Homes Ontario plan, which would see them build like 250,000 affordable or non-market homes. So I think that there's going to be a real tension for the NDP to stick to the conversation they want to have with Ontario.
In terms of the Conservatives, I think we can expect to see them preparing what I would call lots of announceables. So local riding level or regional level things that they want to put in the window and show voters that they're getting results for them. And so I know that offices across government are being asked to look for these types of things so that they can be ready. I still think there's a chance that we don't have an election this winter. I think what I would call the status quo would be they want to be prepared so that they can go, but the government is entirely in control of the timing of this. And so if they don't like what they see, they don't have to. But they're certainly preparing as if they want to be ready and have lots of stories to tell to voters about why they should be reelected.
So speaking of preparing, it seems like one thing that is key for the NDP and the Liberals is kind of differentiating themselves from one another. As I mentioned at the top, how do you convince voters that you're the alternative and you avoid vote splitting? So Kelly, how do the Liberals go about this, convincing voters that they're not the NDP?
Yeah, and I think the Liberal Party, has always presented itself as a centrist party. So while they're competing for votes on the left, I would also argue that they're competing for votes on the right. And Bonnie Crombie has made it, or at least tried to make it clear, that she's a little bit more of a fiscal liberal, is concerned about, keeping balanced budgets, etc. So I think, again, for them, for the Liberals, it's going to be a lot about focusing on the ground game and trying to get back some of the seats that they had previously, both in the city of Toronto, some of which were taken over by the NDP, but a lot of which were actually taken by the Conservatives. And same with in the GTA, where they lost a lot of those seats to the Conservatives as well. So while there is certainly some cross-pollination on, the social policy side with the Liberals and the NDP, I think, very much their target is also the Conservative Party and trying to, like I said, win back some of those seats that had been Liberal seats for a very long time.
I think for the NDP, they're in a similar sort of position for where they want to pick up seats. Most of them are going to be seats that they're going to want to try to wrestle out of the Conservative camp, just because the Conservatives have most of the seats. But what they're going to have to do is show that essentially, we've had 25 years now of Liberal and Conservative governments, and problems have only gotten worse. So the way they need to differentiate between the former Liberal government and them is just to say, look, we saw them for 15 years. It got worse. They weren't doing the policies that we would do. The Tories, well, I think the message will be that they can't be trusted to fix the things that the NDP views as being broken or out of balance. And I think that, again, the challenge for them is going to be like a lot of what the Conservatives have been putting out has been popular. Like it's been, even among some downtown folks, whether it's some of these trial balloons around, how to deal with encampments or other sort of very urban issues. There are people who are not typically Conservative supporters who are sort of nodding along and saying, yeah, it's getting out of hand. So they're going to have to figure out, how do they adopt some of these things that the Conservatives are putting out there successfully and saying they would deal with it a certain way, but maybe change the emphasis or suggest that the priorities aren't right.
You mentioned municipalities a couple of times already, Aidan. I think it goes to show that municipal issues are clearly top of mind right now in the province. So how will this dynamic play out in the coming months as we head for a potential election, or just more generally how the Ford government governs? Aidan, we'll stay with you.
Well, I think, interestingly, I think housing was also seen as a municipal issue, and eventually it sort of ballooned out into a national issue, not just provincial. And so I think that I think that the NDP strategy of going and reaching out to municipal officials, mayors, local councillors, and the like, talking about a new deal that would see municipalities both resource to manage what are appropriately local responsibilities, while also pulling back a lot of the stuff that was downloaded between the conservative and liberal governments of the last quarter century, maybe even bringing us like back to some sort of normal range that the rest of Canada has in terms of a division of fiscal responsibilities and tools. But I think that, you know, the other benefit of focusing in on what are traditionally thought of as municipal issues is that those are the ones that we actually feel every day. So, you know, whether it's you know, providing better infrastructure or better supports for housing, again, public health, looking at the addictions crisis, looking at the sort of public order. These are all things that fundamentally you need to have strong municipal partnerships and well-resourced municipalities if you're going to make a dent on. You can pass all the legislation you want on any of that, but without an understanding of how it's going to be implemented at a local level, you're not going to get much success. And then the flip side of that is making sure that when you're coming up with the ideas, when you're coming up with the priorities, you almost need to start at how would the local level deal with it and how do we support them dealing with it. And I think the NDP are actually being really smart in focusing on what are often considered municipal issues until they balloon out and dwarf both the constitutional orders of government.
Fraser, how does the provincial government go about the relationship with municipalities in the fall sitting and moving forward?
Well, I think while Doug Ford remains popular in the polls, the most popular people in most political networks are local mayors. And so the Conservatives have figured this out and they would like to keep those people happy. And so it doesn't mean that mayors are going to get everything they want, and it doesn't mean there's not going to be occasional disagreements. But I think a lot of the strategy going into the next year is going to be, how can we get the mayors telling our shared voter bases that we've done a good job and we've delivered for them. And so you're starting to see more and more capital funding flowing into municipalities. I know there's conversations going on right now around homeless encampments and drug challenges and what supports municipalities need in order to better address those challenges. And I think despite some of the criticism we've seen from the opposition on this, I think the Ford government is approaching that challenge in a very thoughtful way, where they want to do it right and they know that municipalities need more resources, and that was the start of the conversation. So that would be my expectation in terms of how they're going to try to manage those relationships.
So Kelly, Bonnie Crombie, former mayor, do you think that serves her well to speak to those municipal issues, or is that, and I'd be curious to hear Aidan and Fraser weigh in after, is that a benefit or is that a liability? Because it feels like it's been used as both a sword and a spear depending on who's talking about this.
Well, I think if I was Bonnie Crombie again, I would be hoping that that would help me even, you know, with my fellow mayors really understanding those municipal issues. That being said, Doug Ford is a former Toronto city councillor. I mean, there certainly is a lot of overlap. And I would just say that, you know, the mayors really have to put their own partisanship aside, and they're going to have to work with whomever is in power anyways. And we saw that Olivia Chow was able to very successfully advocate for the city of Toronto to get more funding. And again, that's, you know, every municipality in Ontario, again, would like to see more support from the province on their core issues. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for partnership. And I think, yeah, if Bonnie plays her cards right, then, you know, she might be able to get perhaps support from other people in the municipal sector if they feel like the Liberals are able to offer them a better deal.
I think both Kelly and Fraser have really highlighted a challenge the NDP is going to have, which is, you know, the other parties have a lot to offer, just because, you know, when we look internally at our own sort of team, we think we always get it right and the other guys always get it wrong. I think that if you look at how, like, the average Ontarian has looked at the Ford government's sort of what they've put in place, what they have said as priorities, what they have been pushing forward, it's actually been really well grounded in terms of where Ontarians seem to want to go. And so coming out sort of swinging and they did everything wrong and we're going to do everything right. I mean, nobody wants to hear that. And you're actually trying to get people who maybe voted for one of the other guys to vote for you. And I think part of that is a little bit of humility to say, maybe they did it a way that we wouldn't have done it, but it seems to have satisfied what people were expecting or what people wanted. And don't forget that as you are trying to tend to your own team and maintain solidarity, going and attacking the other parties simply because they're the other parties without really looking at where are Ontarians, what are they being receptive to? I think that's going to be a real tough path for the NDP to go down.
For my last question, thinking ahead, what does success look like for each party this fall, and what's the biggest risk or the biggest threat? We'll start with the government, Fraser.
Stay in the driver's seat, drive the agenda, control what everyone's talking about, successfully get your legislation through, and don't get sidetracked on issues management.
For the NDP, I'd say get out of Ford's car, drive your own car, be in your own driver's seat. Don't get caught up in what the government is putting out necessarily, because you don't know how much of it you may want to borrow in an election or not have had a substantially different position on an election. People need to get to know Marit. You can't just disqualify a sitting government. You have to show how you do better at it. And I think the NDP, that is a tough order already. And I think focus on that. Don't just focus on being the opposition.
And I think success for the Liberals, number one, is they have to regain party status. There's nothing they could do in the legislature without party status. They have 9 MPPs right now. They need to get to 12 seats. I mean, that shouldn't really be an unreasonable goal, but right now polling for them isn't looking very positive. So hopefully they can sort of turn that around over the next few months. Bonnie Crombie needs to win her seat to be an effective leader. And if she doesn't win a seat in the next election, I don't know what that means for her, if that means they'll have to look for a new leader, but that would be thing number 2. I think the other real challenge for the Liberals going forward is also differentiating themselves from the federal Liberals and sort of the anti-Trudeau sentiment that seems to be floating around in the public right now. So that's going to be a big challenge for them, again, showing how they're a different party and how they're a real alternative to Doug Ford. So a lot of work for them to do.
All 3 parties will definitely be quite busy, and so will we at Strategy Corp analyzing what's playing out at Queen's Park. So Kelly, Fraser, Aidan, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a really helpful conversation, and it gets us all ready to analyze and I suppose enjoy, in a way, the fall sitting at Queen's Park. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences. The views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights for this episode are reserved, and the guests on the Intended Consequences podcast might be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the work of the Institute and to subscribe to our newsletter, visit our website at strategycorp.com/institute and make sure to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm Sebastian Lebrec, and I intend to talk to you again next episode.